Well, it's a disaster, isn't it? I mean, we're now in the 8th month of this emergency. It feels very much like we're back in April and nothing's been learned. I've described all the mistakes that were made during that first period in my book, Blinded by Corona, and it just looks as though we're going back over this ground. Vast amounts of money have been spent on this. I'd be very interested to hear what Edwina has to say about the money that's been spent. Somebody needs to own the mess. Now, is it a political ownership? Is it a technical ownership? Is it a public health ownership? Somebody needs to own the mess because lives are at stake here. We've seen that tens of thousands of people died during the first period, and now we're heading into this situation again. This 16,000 that have gone missing indicates that probably we're further up the epidemic curve than we thought we were, and it may well be that the virus is replicating faster than we've been told.
And so it's also, Professor Ashworth, if I may jump in, the reason that's so serious is that had those numbers been included at the right time, then more restrictions may have been brought in sooner. And we know from what happened in March, April, that by delaying big restrictions, it may have cost tens of thousands of lives.
It feels like a rerun of when, we thought that our epidemic curve was gentler than the Italian one. And if you remember that week beginning the 9th of March, when we had the Cheltenham Festival was allowed to go ahead, the Anfield match was allowed to go ahead, and then the modelers realised that they'd been using Duff data in their model and that the curve was much steeper than they'd been telling us. We then had the nonsense for a few days of herd immunity, and then the government panicked, and then, having done too little too late, did too much too late, because they'd failed to get a grip with it. We're in the same territory now.
Well, John Bercow, we spoke to Angela Rayner a little bit earlier on, who was excoriating about the Health Secretary, about the Prime Minister, about the example, for instance, that the President was setting. But it's not just the opposition who are frustrated with Boris Johnson's leadership. It's also backbench MPs. And we know there is this move to vote against their own leadership on the 10 p.m. curfew. Tomorrow, now they finally got a vote on the measures. Is Boris Johnson, now overseeing a shambolic test and trace system, which we know is key to defeating this virus, is he the right man for the job?
Look, let's be absolutely clear. The test, track and trace system is shambolic at best and non-existent at worst. There's just been the most searing and coruscating indictment of the government's performance by Professor Ashton and indeed by many others. When you ask, Susanna, about resignation, let me just say this. This is a government that doesn't believe in accountability. It simply doesn't. And therefore, in that sense, although I completely understand why you and Piers should ask the question about resignation, it is in a sense a red herring. If the Prime Minister isn't going to accept or demand the resignation of the Secretary of State for Education after the exam fiasco over which he presided, if he's not going to ask for the resignation of the Health Secretary despite the fiasco over which he has presided, manifestly, he's not going to resign himself. My critique of the government is that they have had months and months and months of mixed and misleading messages. And frankly, doing press conferences, offering scripted sound bites in televised addresses to the nation or taking to Twitter are no substitute for accountability to Parliament. And so, I'm sorry, Susanna, let me just make this point because I feel extremely passionately about it. Worse, in appearing on your programme, I want to emphasise, is the fact that it is now 161 days since any representative of the government has deigned to appear on your programme. Palpably, that is a considerable insult to you and to Piers, but more importantly, it is a grave insult to 1.5 million of your daily viewers. Now, Susanna, I don't want to spare your or Piers' blushes. I completely understand that ministers will be apprehensive about appearing with Piers and being questioned by him. They face the intellect of Einstein and the eloquence of Demosthenes and the uppercut of Muhammad Ali. But I'm afraid
the intellect of Einstein, by the way.
Sorry?
Yeah, but I think you raise an interesting point, John Bucket, which is it's not just us. They also boycott Channel 4 News and BBC Newsnight. There's a pattern of the shows they don't want to go on. They've also been boycotting parliamentary accountability, which has been, to me, far more serious than not appearing on this programme. Let's come to Edwina Currie. I mean, you come on as a kind of, you know, the defender of all things Boris Johnson. Is there a limit, Edwina Currie, to how far your unequivocal defence of this man will go, given that every week brings a new shambles?
Well, let's start off with test and trace. I would be more impressed with your person who says that he works for them if he actually turned and faced the camera and we saw his name and we knew who he was. He did actually say he had other things to do as well. I can produce a friend from around here who is also doing exactly that job, and she says it's working very well. And of course, in many of the local authorities, they have taken over doing the tracing because they know that arriving on somebody's doorstep is by far the best way. If somebody with a deep voice phoned me and demanded all my friends' details, I probably wouldn't give them either.
16,000 people, Edwina Currie, who were COVID-19 positive, just fell out of the system at the absolutely critical moment of the second wave. Well, they did. An Excel spreadsheet did not transfer it from one organisation to another. We know that.
Piers, they didn't fall out of the system. They were all given their positive test. They were all given the result of their test. And they were all able then to do exactly what most people responsibly ought to do without any prodding from anybody, including from you. They ought to be able to settle down, to go into quarantine. Listen,
none of their contact, because they came, because the Excel, Edwina, because the Excel spreadsheet collapsed between two different entities, it meant that none of the contacts of those 16,000 people were contacted. And now it's almost certainly too late. That puts people's lives at risk. How can you defend this system?
But that's one way of doing it. Other ways of doing it are the person who becomes who tests positive picks up the phone and talks to their friends and family. Another way is if you've got the app on your phone, that will make the contact. I got the app on my phone. Have you got the app on your phone? You should have. Everybody should have. Indeed, everybody working together, anyone that's actually in any contact with anybody else, get the app. It works on both kinds of phones now. It's very useful. And none of these systems are absolutely perfect. We know that. We
were told it was a world-class system. We were assured repeatedly we had a world-class system. The envy...
No, that's the quote. That's not the quote. The quote was that we were aiming at it. We did 1.8 million tests. 1.8 million tests were processed in the last week of September. A few months ago, that wouldn't have looked like a remote possibility.
Do you know, I mean, OK, let me ask you this then. Let me ask you this. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is on television today, boycotting our show. He appears on Sky and says that we're now testing 250,000 tests a day. We're doing 250,000 tests a day. Here's what you said to Sky. So that's the BBC. Have we got the Sky one? No, we don't. Okay, on Sky earlier, he said this. He said, we are doing 250,000 tests a day. By the time he got to the BBC, he promoted that to 250,000 people being tested. They're two completely different figures. In fact, the last I saw for a 7-day period was about 86,000 people being tested a day, but many of them having multiple tests. Do you, since you're representing the government today, and very well, if I may say so, do you know whether we're testing 250,000 people a day, as the Chancellor said, just after 7:30, or whether we're doing 250,000 tests a day, as he said, around 7 o'clock? Do you know which one's true? He is the money guy. He is the stats guy.
Yeah, well, hang on a minute. I look at the government website, and by the way, aren't you jealous of Andrew Marr? He actually got an interview with the Prime Minister.
Actually, you know what? At this stage, if Boris Johnson agrees to appear in your programme, it's really embarrassing because it means he thinks he's going to get an easy ride. So actually, I'm not.
Oh. Let me answer your question. I'm looking at the government website, and they look at. You have to look at it a little bit in retrospect because then they're pretty sure they got the counting right. And it says 1.8 million tests were processed.
I just asked you, Edwina. I just asked you which of the two Chancellor. Edwina, I just asked which of the two Chancellor statements is true. Are we doing 250,000 tests a day, or are we testing 250,000 people? Because he said two different things. Do you know the answer?
I don't.
There we go.
I don't think
That is the world-class test and trace system. We have absolutely no idea, and nor has a former Tory minister got any idea whether it's tests or people. And that just about sums it up.
Okay.
The Chancellor, whose only job it is to get the figures right, hasn't got a clue either.
Edwina, Harry, we have to leave it there. John Bercow, thank you very much, Professor Ashton.
Edwina, your loyalty is admirable, but you're making the best fist of an absolutely risible case. And the truth is, you're savvy enough to know it.
Whatever you do, don't mention salmonella.
I remember when